When David first drove through the gates of Maplewood Heights, he felt a wave of relief. After years of saving, working double shifts, and putting his dreams on hold, he had finally bought a home for himself and his young daughter. The quiet streets, the tall oak trees, the trimmed lawns, it looked like the kind of place where peace lived. He had imagined this moment for so long, a place where his daughter could play safely, where neighbors smiled at one another, and where weekends meant barbecues and laughter. The day they moved in, the sun was bright and the air smelled like new beginnings. David carried boxes from the truck while his daughter ran around the front yard chasing butterflies. A few neighbors walked by, some with polite smiles, others pretending not to notice. David waved anyway, hoping to start on the right foot. Across the street, an elderly man with a stiff posture and silver hair stood watching. His name was Mr. Coleman, the president of the Homeowners Association, known to everyone simply as the HOA. He didn't wave back. He just stared, his eyes following every box David carried inside. David brushed it off, thinking maybe the man was just curious about the new neighbors. That evening, David sat on the porch with a glass of lemonade, enjoying the quiet. The sound of sprinklers and crickets filled the air. He felt proud. He had made it here honestly through hard work and sacrifice. His daughter came and sat beside him, resting her head on his arm. "Daddy, do you think they'll like us here?" she asked softly. He smiled and said, "Of course they will. We'll show them who we are." The first few days were calm. David worked on unpacking, fixing up the garden, and meeting a few neighbors who were friendly enough. A woman next door brought over cookies and introduced herself. A young couple waved while jogging past. Everything seemed fine, until a small white envelope showed up in his mailbox. It was a letter from the HOA. The paper was neatly folded and printed in cold, formal words. "Your property is not in compliance with community standards due to the color of your mailbox. Please repaint to match neighborhood guidelines within 10 days. David frowned. The mailbox was dark gray, clean and new. He looked around the street and noticed other homes with slightly different shades of gray, blue, even black. None looked exactly the same. He shrugged it off, thinking it might be a standard reminder. He repainted the mailbox anyway, just to be safe. But a week later, another envelope came. This time, it complained about the small potted plants on his porch, then about the trash bins being visible from the street, then about his daughter's chalk drawings on the driveway. Every week brought something new. David started to notice how no one else seemed to be getting these letters. The same trash bins stood outside other homes. The same flower pots decorated porches. Yet somehow his home was always singled out. He didn't want to believe it had anything to do with him being one of the only black homeowners in the neighborhood. But deep down, he couldn't ignore the feeling. One evening, while mowing his lawn, David noticed Mr. Coleman standing by the sidewalk again, clipboard in hand, taking notes. Their eyes met. David smiled politely and said, "Evening." Mr. Coleman didn't respond. He just wrote something down and walked away. Later that night, David sat on his couch staring at the growing stack of letters. His daughter walked in, holding one of her chalks. "Daddy, are we in trouble again?" she asked innocently. He put the letters aside and smiled at her. "No, sweetheart. We're not in trouble. Sometimes people just don't understand right away. But that's okay. We'll keep being kind." He said the words with calmness. But inside, he felt uneasy. A few days later, a neighborhood event was announced. A community barbecue hosted by the HOA. David decided to go, hoping it might help smooth things over. He made his famous grilled chicken and brought a dish to share. His daughter carried a plate of cookies she helped bake. When they arrived, most people were already there, chatting in small groups. As they walked up, conversations quieted for a moment. Then people went back to talking, pretending not to notice. David smiled, greeted a few people, and tried to blend in. He approached Mr. Coleman, who was standing near the buffet table. "Hi, I'm David. Just wanted to thank you for organizing this. Beautiful neighborhood you've got here," David said, extending his hand. Mr. Coleman looked at his hand, hesitated for a second, then shook it briefly. "We try to maintain certain standards here," he said flatly. "We've had issues before with people not following the rules." David nodded politely. "I understand. I'm just trying to make sure I'm doing everything right." "Well," Mr. Coleman replied with a tight smile, "if you read the HOA manual carefully, you'll be fine." The conversation ended there. David walked away, feeling the sting of something he couldn't quite name. He noticed a few neighbors watching, whispering behind their cups. His daughter tugged at his sleeve and asked if they could go home. That night, after putting her to bed, David sat outside under the porch light, thinking about everything that had happened. He remembered all the warnings from friends when he first bought the house, about how some neighborhoods still had people who looked down on others for no reason. He had refused to believe it then. He believed that hard work and good manners could win anyone over. But now he wasn't so sure, still he refused to give up. He had worked too hard to let anyone chase him away. The next morning, David went about his day as usual. He trimmed the lawn, cleaned the porch, and waved at passing cars. Some waved back awkwardly, others didn't. Later, he received another letter, this time saying that his lawn decorations violated HOA rules. He looked down at the so-called decoration. It was just a small welcome sign that said "Home Sweet Home." He let out a small laugh. "This is getting ridiculous," he muttered. Days turned into weeks, and the letters kept coming. David began documenting everything, taking photos, saving envelopes, writing down dates and times. He wasn't sure what he'd do with them yet, but something told him to keep a record. Then one afternoon, while he was washing his car, a woman from 2 houses down walked over. She looked around nervously and whispered, "I've been seeing how they treat you. It's not right. They've done it before. A family that used to live here, same thing. They pushed them out." David listened quietly, surprised by her honesty. "Why didn't anyone say anything?" he asked. She looked down. "People are scared of the HOA. They fine you for everything if you speak up." David nodded slowly. "Thank you for telling me." That night he sat at his dining table staring at the growing pile of letters and photos. His daughter came over and hugged him from behind. "Don't be sad, Daddy," she said softly. "You always tell me good people win." Her words lit something inside him. He smiled and kissed her forehead. "You're right. Good people do win, just not always right away." The next day, David went to the HOA office, a small building at the edge of the community. Mr. Coleman was there, sitting behind his desk. "Morning," David said calmly. "I wanted to ask about these violations. I just want to understand what exactly I'm doing wrong." Mr. Coleman adjusted his glasses and said, "It's not personal, Mr. Davis. We just enforce the rules. Everyone gets the same treatment." David looked him in the eye. "I've noticed others have the same lawn chairs, the same bins, even the same mailboxes. Yet I'm the only one getting fined." Mr. Coleman leaned back, expression unreadable. "Maybe their homes blend in better. Maybe yours just stands out more." David nodded slowly, controlling his anger. "I see. Thank you for clarifying." He turned and left without another word. That night, as he tucked his daughter into bed, David made himself a quiet promise. He would no longer just take the unfairness in silence. He wasn't going to lose the home he had worked his whole life for. He would fight back, but not with anger. With truth. With patience. With proof. Outside, the streetlights glowed over the peaceful neighborhood, the one that had started to feel less like home. But David knew his story wasn't ending here. It was only beginning. The morning sun shone softly over Maplewood Heights, but for David, each new day began with the same feeling, wondering what the HOA would complain about next. What had once felt like a dream home now carried a quiet tension. Still, he tried to keep his days normal. He made breakfast for his daughter, dropped her off at school, and went to work like everyone else. But every evening when he returned home, another white envelope waited in the mailbox. At first, he tried to laugh it off. Maybe they just really like sending letters, he told his daughter, pretending it was no big deal. But inside, he felt the pressure building. The letters were piling up fast, each one accusing him of something different. One week it was grass length not meeting HOA standards. The next week it was improper porch furniture. Then children's toys visible from the front yard. His daughter's pink bicycle, which she loved to ride every evening, was apparently a problem too. The notice said it made the neighborhood look unkempt. David read it twice, shaking his head. He couldn't understand why something so small, something so innocent, could upset anyone. He started to realize this wasn't about rules. It was about someone trying to push him out. One afternoon, while mowing his lawn, David noticed Mr. Coleman again, clipboard in hand, sunglasses on, standing on the sidewalk across the street. Every few minutes he scribbled something down. David stopped the mower, walked over, and said politely, "Afternoon. Is there something wrong?" Mr. Coleman didn't look up from his paper. "Just making sure all homes are keeping up with community standards," he replied. David smiled lightly. "I see. Well, if there's something I need to fix, you can let me know directly." Mr. Coleman finally looked up. "Oh, we will. Don't worry." There was something about the way he said it that made David's stomach tighten. Later that week, David attended the monthly HOA meeting, hoping to clear things up. The meeting was held in the small clubhouse at the center of the neighborhood. About a dozen people sat around a long table. When David walked in, the chatter quieted. He took a seat near the back. Mr. Coleman opened the meeting with a list of agenda items: noise complaints, maintenance updates, parking issues. Then he said, "Next, we have several unresolved violations from property lot 27 belonging to Mr. Davis." All eyes turned to him. David felt heat rise in his chest, but he kept his voice calm. "I just wanted to ask what exactly I'm doing wrong. I've been following every guideline I was given." Mr. Coleman flipped through a stack of papers. "Let's see. Mailbox color, lawn decor, visible bins, grass height, and several others. We've documented all of them." David nodded slowly. "I've fixed every single thing that was mentioned. I even repainted the mailbox twice, but I noticed others haven't and they don't seem to get letters." A woman sitting beside Coleman shifted uncomfortably. She whispered something, but he ignored her. "We treat all homeowners equally," he said. "I just want fairness," David replied. "That's all I'm asking for." Mr. Coleman leaned forward. "Then I suggest you learn the rules thoroughly. Maplewood Heights has standards that must be upheld. If you can't meet them, maybe this isn't the right neighborhood for you." The words hung in the air like cold smoke. David didn't respond. He simply gathered his papers, thanked the group, and left the room. Behind him, whispers filled the air again. That night, David couldn't sleep. He sat at the kitchen table surrounded by envelopes, photos, and notes. He started organizing them into folders. He realized that what was happening wasn't just about him, it was about something bigger. If this had happened to other families before and no one stood up, then maybe this was his chance to finally stop it. But before he could act, things got worse. A few days later, David came home to find a bright orange notice taped to his front door. It said, "Final warning, property in repeated violation of HOA standards." His heart sank. The paper listed 5 violations, all of them false. Things like clutter visible on porch, unapproved color choice for door, and failure to remove unsightly lawn items. He looked around. The porch was spotless. The door was painted the same neutral color it had always been. The lawn was trimmed. Everything was perfect. He tore the notice down, his hands shaking. His daughter came running out of the house. "Daddy, what's wrong?" she asked, her eyes wide. He took a deep breath, forcing a smile. "Nothing we can't handle, sweetheart. Just some paperwork." That evening, as they sat for dinner, he noticed her quietness. She poked her food with her fork. "Daddy, why don't they like us?" she asked softly. He froze for a moment. "What do you mean?" "I heard some kids today. They said their parents don't want them to come here. They said we're different." David's chest ached. He reached across the table and held her hand. "People sometimes say things they don't understand. But we don't let that change who we are, okay?" She nodded, but her eyes were full of sadness. That night, David stayed up late in the living room, staring out the window at the quiet neighborhood. The same homes, the same lights, the same street. Yet it didn't feel like home anymore. The next morning, he took action. He started filming short clips on his phone. The front yard, the porch, the driveway. Everything that could prove he was being treated unfairly. He recorded the dates, the letters, even the times he saw Mr. Coleman inspecting his property. A week later, another notice arrived, and this one, summoning him to a formal HOA hearing to review continued violations. The letter warned that failure to comply could lead to property revocation. Procedures. David stared at the paper for a long time. Then he folded it neatly and placed it on the table. He had a choice: give up or fight back. He chose to fight. Before the hearing, he visited the county records office to review HOA policies and legal rights. He spent evenings researching homeowner laws and discrimination cases. Every detail mattered. He was quiet about it, but he was preparing carefully. Meanwhile, small things around his property started changing. Someone poured detergent on his grass, leaving dead patches. His mailbox was dented one morning. His trash bins were knocked over repeatedly. It was subtle. Nothing big enough to prove, but enough to send a message. Still, David refused to lose his calm. He kept showing up to work, taking care of his daughter and fixing what was damaged. His neighbors watched silently, some with pity, some with guilt. Only one woman occasionally waved and asked if he was doing okay. The day of the hearing finally arrived. It was held in the same clubhouse as before, but this time, more people showed up. Word had spread about the trouble with Lot 27. David walked in wearing a clean shirt, holding a folder under his arm. His daughter had made him a small note that morning that said, "You got this, Daddy." He carried it in his pocket. When he entered, Mr. Coleman and the board were already seated. The air felt heavy, tense. Mr. Coleman spoke first. "Mr. Davis, we've called this hearing to discuss repeated violations. It appears you have failed to comply with our community's appearance standards." David placed his folder on the table and said calmly, "Before you continue, I'd like to present some evidence." He pulled out printed photos, time-stamped videos, and copies of every letter he had received. He laid them out in neat rows. "Here's my lawn, trimmed weekly. Here's my porch, clean and clear. My mailbox color matches at least 6 other homes in this neighborhood. I have records of every interaction and every repair." The room went quiet. A few people leaned forward to look. Mr. Coleman shifted uncomfortably. "This isn't a courtroom, Mr. Davis. We're not here for arguments." David nodded. "Then I just ask one question. Why am I the only homeowner receiving weekly violations for things others are allowed to have?" No one answered. The silence stretched long. A few board members exchanged glances. One woman cleared her throat and said softly, "Maybe we should review this further." Mr. Coleman frowned, tapping his pen on the table. "Rules are rules. If you can't follow them, we'll have to consider stronger measures." David stood up, gathering his papers. "Thank you for your time," he said calmly. "I'll make sure this meeting is properly documented." He left the room quietly, but the look on his face had changed. The calmness in his steps wasn't defeat. It was determination. That night he sat on his porch, watching the streetlights flicker. His daughter came outside, curling up next to him. "Did it go okay?" she asked. He smiled gently. It went exactly how it needed to. From that moment, David knew he wasn't just protecting his house, and he was standing up for his right to belong. And though he didn't know it yet, the quiet strength he carried would soon shake the entire neighborhood to its core. The notice for the formal hearing came early in the morning, printed in bold black letters, slipped under David's front door. It said he was required to appear before the HOA board in 2 weeks to discuss continued non-compliance with community standards. The tone was cold, almost threatening. At the bottom was Mr. Coleman's signature, firm and proud, as if the outcome was already decided. David read the letter twice, then set it down slowly on the kitchen counter. His daughter was still asleep upstairs. The house was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. He stood there for a long moment, staring at the letter, feeling both angry and strangely calm. He knew this was what they had been building toward all along. This hearing was not about rules. It was about control. Later that day, David went through his binder, checking every document he had collected over the past months. Every notice, every letter, every photo, all carefully organized by date. He even had recordings of conversations, including the last HOA meeting where Mr. Coleman hinted that maybe this isn't the right neighborhood for him. He didn't want to believe that statement was meant the way it sounded, but now it was hard to see it any other way. He spent the following days preparing quietly. He read through local housing laws, watched videos about HOA rights, and even reached out to a legal advice center online. A volunteer lawyer told him to stay calm, keep everything documented, and record the hearing if possible. "Facts always win over emotions," the man said. "Let them show their own bias." David took that advice to heart. He didn't want revenge. He wanted fairness. In the evenings after dinner, he and his daughter would sit on the porch. She would talk about school and he would listen, pretending everything was fine. But she could sense the tension. "Are they still being mean to you?" she asked one night, her voice quiet. He smiled and said softly, "They're just testing how strong we are. But we're doing fine. She nodded, but her eyes told him she didn't fully believe it. As the day of the hearing drew closer, the neighborhood's energy seemed to shift. Some neighbors avoided eye contact when David passed by. Others gave him small nods of support when no one else was watching. He noticed curtains move when he walked his daughter to the school bus. Everyone knew about the upcoming hearing. Some treated it like gossip, others like a warning. On the morning of the hearing, the sky was gray and heavy with clouds. David dressed neatly, clean shirt, pressed pants, shoes polished. Before leaving, his daughter handed him a small folded note. "Read it when you get nervous," she said, smiling shyly. He put it in his pocket. The HOA clubhouse was already half full when he arrived. The long rectangular table was set up at the front, with 5 board members seated behind it. Mr. Coleman sat in the center, looking as confident as ever. Behind him a banner read, "Maintaining Excellence in Maplewood Heights." Several residents had gathered as observers. Some looked curious, others looked uncomfortable. The air felt thick. "Mr. Davis," Mr. Coleman said formally, "please have a seat." David nodded politely and sat down in the single chair placed in front of the table. He placed his folder of evidence on his lap, his hands steady. Mr. Coleman cleared his throat. "This hearing has been called to address continued violations at your property, despite multiple warnings and opportunities for correction. The board has expressed concerns regarding your failure to comply with several community standards." David listened carefully. His expression calm, Mr. Coleman continued, listing off alleged violations: lawn decor, mailbox color, porch furniture, unapproved exterior modifications. Each one was read as though it were a serious crime. When he finished, David spoke clearly. "With respect, sir, I have corrected every issue mentioned in the notices. I have documentation to prove that my property meets all HOA requirements. If I may, I'd like to share that evidence." Mr. Coleman raised an eyebrow but nodded. "Go ahead." David opened his folder and began laying out photos one by one. "This is my mailbox, repainted twice to match the approved color. Here's the timestamp. Here's the grass, measured at standard height. Here are photos of other homes with the same type of porch chairs and decorations, none of which have received any violations." A low murmur rippled through the room. A few people leaned forward to look. David continued, his tone even but firm. "I've done everything by the book. I've also recorded some of our previous meetings for accuracy. During one of them, certain remarks were made suggesting that maybe I don't belong in this neighborhood. I'm sure that wasn't the intended meaning, but I'd like the board to clarify that." Mr. Coleman's face tightened. "Recordings? That's inappropriate, Mr. Davis. This is a private meeting." David met his gaze calmly. "Actually, under state law, I'm allowed to record any meeting I'm part of for personal records." The room fell silent. For a long moment, no one spoke. The other board members shifted in their seats. One of them, a woman with short brown hair, looked uneasy. "Maybe we should pause and review this carefully," she said quietly. Mr. Coleman ignored her. "This isn't about personal feelings," he said sharply. "It's about maintaining community standards. We can't have residents picking and choosing which rules they follow." David nodded. "I agree completely. But I also believe rules should apply to everyone equally." The tension in the room grew heavier. Mr. Coleman glanced around, clearly frustrated that the meeting wasn't going the way he'd planned. "We'll proceed with a vote," he announced. "All in favor of initiating property removal procedures for Lot 27? A few hesitant hands went up. Some board members avoided eye contact altogether. David watched silently, not reacting. When the vote ended, Mr. Coleman straightened his papers. "The motion passes. We'll proceed with formal eviction filing pending review." The words hit like a hammer, but David didn't flinch. He calmly gathered his documents, placed them back in his folder, and stood up. "Thank you for your time," he said. Before leaving, he added softly, "Everything that happened here today is recorded. I'll make sure it's reviewed by the right authorities." Then he walked out, his steps steady, his heart pounding but his mind clear. Outside, the air felt colder than before. The clouds had thickened and a light drizzle began to fall. David stood for a moment under the overhang, breathing deeply. He reached into his pocket and unfolded the small note his daughter had given him. It said, "You're stronger than them. I believe in you." A small smile touched his face. That night he didn't sleep much. Instead, he sat at his desk with his laptop open, typing a long report. Every detail, every violation notice, every statement made at the hearing. He uploaded photos, timestamps, and audio recordings. When he finished, he sent everything to the local housing authority and a civil rights legal group that handled HOA discrimination complaints. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew he had done the right thing. Days passed quietly. Neighbors whispered more than usual, and a few even stopped by his house to talk. One man who had lived in the neighborhood for over 10 years told him, "They've been doing this for a while. You're not the first, but you might be the one who finally stops them." David appreciated the words but didn't say much. He just nodded and kept his focus on his daughter, on work, and on patience. He believed truth had its own timing. Then one afternoon, a white SUV pulled up in front of his house. Two people stepped out, both wearing suits. They introduced themselves as investigators from the housing authority. "We received your complaint," one of them said. "We'd like to ask a few questions." For the first time in months, David felt a weight lift from his chest. The investigators spent hours reviewing the documents. They took copies of the letters, listened to his recordings, and examined the photos. One of them looked at David and said quietly, "You've done everything right. We'll handle it from here." That evening, as the sun set over the quiet street, David sat on his porch again. The air felt lighter, though he knew the fight wasn't over. His daughter came out carrying 2 mugs of hot chocolate. She handed one to him and said, "Did we win?" He smiled and said, "Not yet, but we started something good." She leaned against his shoulder, and together they watched the lights flicker on across the neighborhood. The same homes that once made him feel like an outsider now felt different. The truth was finally beginning to move, slow but unstoppable. David didn't know it yet, but the hearing that was meant to silence him had done the opposite. It had given him the evidence, the resolve, and the allies he needed. And soon, the entire community would hear the truth that some had tried to bury. The quiet man they tried to push out was just getting started. The neighborhood was unusually quiet the week after the hearing. David could feel the silence every time he stepped outside. The usual morning joggers no longer passed by his house, and the few who did kept their heads down. The once friendly waves from across the street were gone. It was as if everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. He tried to keep life as normal as possible. Every morning he packed his daughter's lunch, dropped her at school, and went to work like always. But deep down, he knew something big was coming. The housing investigators had promised to look into his case, but they hadn't shared many details. So he waited, trusting that truth had a way of showing itself, even when people tried to hide it. Then, one afternoon, a thick envelope arrived in his mailbox. It was from the Fair Housing Commission. David's hands trembled slightly as he opened it. Inside were several pages, official documents confirming that an investigation had been launched against the Maplewood Heights HOA for discriminatory practices. They had taken his evidence seriously. His recordings, his photos, and the detailed timeline he'd kept had made a strong impression. The letter also mentioned that the HOA would be notified immediately, and all enforcement actions against his property were to be paused until the investigation was complete. David felt a rush of relief. For the first time in months, he could breathe. That evening, he made dinner with a lighter heart. His daughter noticed right away. "You're smiling again," she said with a grin. He laughed softly. "Yeah, I guess I am. What happened?" she asked. "Let's just say," he replied. The truth finally knocked on the right door. She didn't fully understand, but her father's calm confidence was enough for her. 2 days later, the ripple effect began. Every member of the HOA board received their own thick envelope, just like David's. But theirs carried a very different message, a formal notice of investigation. Rumors spread fast. By evening, whispers filled the neighborhood like wind through the trees. People who had once avoided David's gaze now looked at him with a mix of curiosity and guilt. Mr. Coleman, however, was not one to back down easily. He called for an emergency HOA meeting, claiming it was a misunderstanding. Flyers went up around the neighborhood, inviting homeowners to attend and discuss recent false allegations. David received a copy too. He smiled faintly as he read it. He had no plans to argue anymore. His part was done. The rest would unfold on its own. When the day of the meeting came, the community center was packed. Almost every homeowner was there. Mr. Coleman stood at the front trying to keep his usual composed tone, but the tension in the room was different now. People weren't afraid anymore. They were angry. "I want to address the rumors," Mr. Coleman began. "Our HOA has always acted fairly and professionally. These accusations are baseless. One homeowner has chosen to misrepresent our work to the authorities." Before he could continue, a woman from the crowd stood up. "Baseless?" she said loudly. "I've lived here for 6 years and I've seen the way you treat certain people. You fined my sister for having wind chimes, but others have had them for years with no issue." Murmurs of agreement filled the room. Another man spoke up. "You made my elderly mother cry because she forgot to put her bins away one night. But the people on the next street left theirs out for a week and you said nothing." Mr. Coleman's confident mask began to crack. "That's not true," he snapped. "We enforce the same rules for everyone." Then David stood up slowly from his seat near the back. The room went silent. "I have recordings," he said calmly, "from the meeting where you told me maybe this isn't the right neighborhood for me. And from another, where you said people like me stand out too much. The investigators have copies of those recordings." Gasps filled the room. Mr. Coleman's face turned pale. "You're twisting my words," he said quickly. David shook his head. "I don't need to twist anything. The truth speaks for itself." The crowd erupted with whispers and side conversations. Several people demanded answers. Others said they were ashamed for staying silent. The board members sitting beside Mr. Coleman exchanged uneasy looks, clearly shaken. One woman on the board finally stood up. "I can't be part of this anymore," she said firmly. "I joined to help our community, not to divide it." She placed her badge on the table and walked out. That was the moment everything shifted. News traveled fast beyond Maplewood Heights. Within days, a local reporter contacted David, asking for permission to share his story. He hesitated at first, not wanting to bring unwanted attention to his daughter. But after some thought, he agreed, as long as they kept things respectful and focused on the issue. Fairness. The next week, an article appeared online titled, "Homeowner Takes Stand Against HOA Discrimination, Investigation Underway." The story spread quickly. Other residents from nearby communities began reaching out, sharing their own experiences. People he had never met before thanked him for having the courage to speak up. Meanwhile, the HOA board started to crumble. 2 members resigned. The rest went quiet, avoiding public comments. Mr. Coleman, however, refused to step down. He continued sending statements claiming innocence, but the more he talked, the worse things got. Every denial he made only drew more attention to what David had exposed. One morning, a news van parked at the entrance of the neighborhood. Cameras rolled as the reporter stood outside the HOA office, explaining how the investigation had uncovered years of complaints that had been ignored or hidden. Interviews with residents followed, people who admitted they had stayed silent out of fear. David watched it all from his living room, feeling a mix of sadness and pride. He had never wanted revenge. All he ever wanted was fairness, respect, and a sense of belonging. A few days later, a letter arrived from the Fair Housing Commission. The investigation had concluded. The HOA had been found guilty of discriminatory behavior and abuse of authority. The board was ordered to pay fines and issue a public apology to David and other affected residents. They were also required to implement new leadership elections. David read the letter quietly, taking it all in. Then he set it down, leaned back, and let out a long breath. It was over. That weekend, the apology letter arrived. It was cold and formal, but it was enough. The new interim board members visited David personally, expressing regret for what had happened. They thanked him for bringing the truth to light. But the biggest surprise came when several neighbors gathered outside his home with flowers and thank you notes. They said they were sorry for not speaking up sooner. David didn't know what to say. He simply smiled and told them, "Let's just make sure no one else ever has to go through this." The neighborhood began to change after that. The tension that once hung in the air slowly lifted. People started greeting each other again, not just out of politeness but out of genuine warmth. Kids played freely in the streets. New families moved in, families from all kinds of backgrounds. One evening, as the sun dipped below the trees, David sat on his porch with his daughter. She looked up at him and said, "So we won?" He smiled softly. "We did more than win. We showed them who we are," she grinned. "Can we paint the mailbox pink now?" He laughed. "Let's not push our luck just yet." They both laughed. and for the first time in a long while the sound felt easy and free. Later that night, as David looked around his peaceful home, he realized something important. The victory wasn't just about keeping his house. It was about reclaiming his dignity. It was about teaching his daughter that no matter how unfair the world can be, truth has a way of shining through. And as the stars began to appear over Maplewood Heights, David knew that the place which once tried to push him away had finally become what it should have been all along, a real community. Months passed since the day the investigation ended, but the changes in Maplewood Heights were still unfolding. The air that once carried tension now felt calm and open. People who used to avoid eye contact now waved, stopped to chat, and even asked David for advice on how to improve their homes. It was almost hard to believe this was the same neighborhood that had once tried to force him out. David had never been one to seek attention. Yet somehow his quiet fight had become something bigger than him. Letters still came in the mail, not the kind with threats or fines anymore, but handwritten notes from people in other towns. Some said they were inspired by his courage. Others shared their own stories about unfair treatment and how they had finally found the strength to speak up. Every time David read one of those letters, he felt a deep sense of gratitude. It reminded him that what he went through had a purpose. His pain had turned into someone else's hope. One bright Saturday morning, the neighborhood came alive with chatter. A new event was taking place. The Maplewood Heights Community Fair. It was the first big gathering organized by the newly elected HOA board. Booths lined the park, kids ran around with painted faces, and local vendors sold everything from baked pies to lemonade. David stood at the edge of the park for a moment, just watching. It felt surreal. The same park where he had once been ignored was now filled with laughter, music, and unity. He finally decided to walk in. As he moved through the crowd, several people stopped to greet him warmly. "Hey David, glad to see you here," one man said, clapping him on the shoulder. Another woman offered him a plate of cookies and said, "We wouldn't have this day without you." He smiled politely each time, still feeling a bit shy about the attention. He didn't see himself as a hero, just someone who refused to be silent. Near the stage, the new HOA president, a kind woman named Mrs. Green, tapped the microphone. "Can I have everyone's attention for a moment?" she said with a cheerful tone. "Before we continue the fun, I'd like to take a moment to thank someone who taught us what community really means." David's heart skipped. He already knew where this was going. Mrs. Green continued, "When things were divided, when our neighborhood lost its way, this person stood tall, not with anger, but with truth. And because of that, Maplewood Heights became stronger." She gestured toward David. "Please, everyone, help me thank him." Applause broke out across the park. Long, genuine applause that made David's eyes sting. He wasn't someone who cried easily, but in that moment emotion filled his chest. For so long he had felt like an outsider. Now he was being recognized as part of the very place that once rejected him. He walked to the stage slowly, his daughter by his side. Mrs. Green handed him the microphone with a smile. "Would you like to say a few words?" she asked. David looked at the crowd. Familiar faces, new families, people from all walks of life. He took a deep breath. "I didn't plan to speak," he began softly, "but I want to say thank you. When I first moved here, I wanted what everyone wants. A home, peace, a safe place for my daughter. Things didn't go as I hoped, and for a while I thought about leaving." The crowd was silent, listening closely. "But then," he continued, "I realized something. Running away wouldn't change anything. Sometimes when life pushes you to the edge, you have two choices, give up or stand up. I chose to stand." He paused, his voice steady but full of emotion. "And I'm glad I did, because what happened after wasn't just about me. It was about all of us. We learned how to see each other again, not by color, not by title, but by heart." A soft murmur of agreement spread through the crowd. David smiled. "So let's keep it that way. Let's make sure Maplewood Heights stays a place where no one has to feel like they don't belong. Because at the end of the day, this isn't just a neighborhood. It's our home." Applause rose again, louder this time. His daughter hugged him tightly, whispering, "I'm proud of you, Dad." He looked down at her and whispered back, "I'm proud of us." As the event went on, David stayed to help clean up. Neighbors who once ignored him now worked beside him, sharing jokes and stories. A few of the younger residents even asked for his advice on how to start a community project. He realized, in small ways, the power of one act of courage could spread further than anyone expected.